Warner Brothers Studios, Burbank, California. March 15, 1974. 2:47 p.m. The conference room on the fourth floor of the executive building was thick with cigarette smoke and the kind of tension that accompanies decisions worth millions of dollars. Around the polished mahogany table sat the most powerful men in Hollywood, studio executives, producers, and creative visionaries who were gambling everything on a single, unprecedented bet: bringing Superman to the big screen. At the head of the table, producer Alexander Salkind shuffled through a stack of 8x10 photographs, each one representing a potential Man of Steel. Marlon Brando's brooding intensity stared back from one glossy print. Christopher Reeve's wholesome American features smiled from another. But it was the photograph that Salkind held longest, the one that made everyone in the room lean forward with anticipation that would have changed not just film history, but the entire trajectory of American popular culture. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, wearing a cape. "Gentlemen," Salkind said, his Hungarian accent thick with excitement, "imagine Elvis as Superman, the most famous man in America playing the most famous hero in America. It would be the biggest motion picture event in history." The room erupted in animated discussion, but creative consultant Tom Mankiewicz, who would later write the screenplay, remained silent. He had been in this business long enough to know that the most extraordinary casting decisions often seemed impossible until someone made them real. And he had been thinking about Elvis Presley for weeks, ever since Salkind had first floated the idea. What nobody in that room could have predicted was that this conversation, this single moment of Hollywood ambition, would set in motion a series of events that would bring Elvis closer to playing Superman than anyone would ever publicly acknowledge. And what they certainly couldn't have foreseen was how close the world came to witnessing the most unlikely and potentially revolutionary casting decision in cinema history. This is the documented story of how Elvis Presley almost became Superman, how a secret screen test was filmed and then buried, and how a combination of Colonel Parker's machinations, studio politics, and Elvis's own complicated relationship with his public image prevented what could have been the greatest comeback performance of his career. The origins of Superman's journey to the big screen began in 1973, when Alexander and Ilya Salkind acquired the film rights to the character from DC Comics. The father and son producing team had made their fortune with unconventional projects, and they understood that Superman represented both enormous commercial potential and unprecedented creative challenges. The character had never been successfully translated to cinema. Previous attempts had been limited to low-budget serials and television shows that, while beloved by fans, had never captured the epic scope that the character deserved. The Salkinds envisioned something different, a big-budget spectacular that would treat Superman with the same seriousness that Hollywood reserved for its most prestigious projects. But casting Superman presented unique challenges. The character needed to embody contradictory qualities: otherworldly power and human vulnerability, American idealism and universal appeal, physical strength and emotional depth. Traditional leading men of the era seemed either too conventional or too sophisticated for the role. The Salkinds needed someone who could command attention while maintaining the innocence that made Superman appealing to audiences of all ages. It was Ilya Salkind who first suggested Elvis Presley. "My father thought I was insane," Ilya would later recall in a 1989 interview with American Film magazine. "But I had been watching Elvis's performances from the Vegas period, and I saw something that other people weren't seeing. Here was a man who commanded absolute attention from audiences, who had this incredible physical presence, but who also had this vulnerability, this sincerity that came through even in his most energetic performances." The idea was audacious to the point of seeming absurd. Elvis was known for hip-swiveling rock and roll performances and cheesy Hollywood musicals, not serious, dramatic acting. He had no experience with action films, science fiction, or comic book adaptations. His public image was firmly established as the king of rock and roll, not as a traditional leading man. But Ilya Salkind saw possibilities that others missed. Elvis possessed the physical presence that Superman required. He was tall, powerfully built, and naturally charismatic in ways that filled any space he occupied. More importantly, Elvis had demonstrated in his best musical performances an ability to convey genuine emotion while maintaining larger-than-life appeal. Superman isn't really about superpowers, Salkind explained to his skeptical father. He's about someone who has unlimited power but chooses to use it to help people. That requires a kind of innate decency, a fundamental goodness that has to come from the performer himself. Elvis had that quality. You could see it in his interactions with fans, in his generosity, in the way he carried himself. He was someone who, despite enormous fame and success, had never lost touch with basic human kindness. The elder Salkind was initially resistant, but as they began developing the project through 1973, the idea of Elvis as Superman began to seem less absurd and more intriguing. Elvis's recent success in Las Vegas had demonstrated his ability to appeal to adult audiences. His television special in 1968 had shown that he could handle more serious material when properly directed. And his natural charisma was undeniable. He possessed the kind of star power that could carry a major motion picture. By early 1974, the Salkinds were seriously considering Elvis for the role. They had secured financing from Warner Brothers and were beginning to assemble the creative team that would bring Superman to the screen. Director Richard Donner hadn't been hired yet, but the producers were already thinking about how to approach Elvis with an offer that would be impossible to refuse. The challenge was Colonel Tom Parker. Parker had managed Elvis's career since 1955, and his control over every aspect of Elvis's professional life was absolute. No movie deals, no television appearances, no major decisions happened without Parker's approval. And Parker's approach to Elvis's career had always been conservative, focused on guaranteed paydays rather than artistic risks. The Colonel's management style had served Elvis well financially. He was one of the highest-paid entertainers in the world, with a steady stream of income from Las Vegas performances, record sales, and merchandise. But Parker's risk-averse approach had also limited Elvis's artistic development, keeping him locked into a pattern of safe, predictable projects that maximized short-term profits while potentially limiting long-term creative growth. Tom Mankiewicz, who was brought in to develop the Superman screenplay, understood the challenge of approaching Elvis through Parker. The Colonel was a master at maximizing Elvis's earning potential, but he was also incredibly protective of Elvis's image and extremely suspicious of anything that might challenge the established formula that had made them both wealthy, Mankiewicz recalled in his memoir. The initial approach came in May 1974, when Alexander Salkind flew to Las Vegas to meet with Parker during one of Elvis's residencies at the International Hotel. The meeting took place in Parker's suite, away from Elvis himself, following the Colonel's standard protocol of handling all business negotiations personally. Salkind's pitch was carefully calculated to appeal to Parker's business instincts while addressing his likely concerns about artistic risk. The Superman film would be a major studio production with an enormous budget, offering Elvis the highest salary of his career. The role would showcase Elvis's natural charisma and physical presence without requiring him to sing or perform musical numbers. Most importantly, playing Superman would elevate Elvis's status from entertainer to serious film actor, opening up new career possibilities and potentially extending his relevance to younger generations. Parker listened to the presentation with his characteristic inscrutability, asking detailed questions about the budget, the shooting schedule, and the marketing plans. But when Salkind finished his pitch, Parker's response was cautious to the point of seeming disinterested. The Colonel's concern wasn't really about whether Elvis could play Superman, Mankiewicz later observed. His concern was about whether Superman was the right fit for Elvis's carefully cultivated image. Parker had spent 20 years building Elvis into the king of rock and roll. The idea of Elvis in a cape and tights, flying around saving the world, might have seemed like a departure that could diminish rather than enhance his cultural status. But Parker didn't reject the idea immediately. Instead, he did what he always did when presented with major career decisions. He began negotiating from a position of extreme caution while leaving himself room to maneuver if the deal became too attractive to refuse. Parker's initial demands were staggering, even by Hollywood standards. He wanted Elvis to receive not just a massive upfront salary, but also a percentage of the film's profits, approval over the director and key creative personnel, and guarantees about how Elvis would be promoted and marketed in connection with the film. More controversially, Parker insisted that Elvis should be allowed to perform at least one song in the movie, arguing that audiences expected musical performances from Elvis and would be disappointed if Superman was completely divorced from his musical identity. The song requirement revealed Parker's fundamental misunderstanding of what made the Superman project special. The whole point of casting Elvis was to showcase his dramatic abilities and physical presence, to prove that he was more than just a rock and roll performer. Adding musical numbers would turn Superman into just another Elvis vehicle rather than the serious dramatic film that could redefine his career. But Parker's demands weren't just about money and creative control. They were about maintaining his authority over Elvis's career decisions. The Colonel had built his reputation on his ability to secure the best possible deals for Elvis, and any negotiation that didn't result in unprecedented financial terms would be seen as a failure of his management abilities. The negotiations continued through the summer of 1974, with both sides making incremental compromises while protecting their core interests. The Salkinds were willing to pay Elvis an enormous salary and grant him significant creative input, but they remained firm on their vision of Superman as a dramatic role rather than a musical showcase. Meanwhile, Elvis himself remained largely unaware of the specific details of the negotiations. Parker handled all business discussions personally, providing Elvis with only general information about potential projects while making the actual decisions about which opportunities to pursue. This dynamic became crucial as the Superman discussions progressed, because Elvis's own feelings about the role might have been very different from Parker's calculated assessment of its commercial viability. According to Charlie Hodge, who was with Elvis constantly during this period, Elvis was intrigued by the idea of playing Superman when Parker first mentioned it. Elvis had always been interested in comic books and science fiction, Hodge recalled in a 1985 interview. He thought Superman was a character that represented good values, someone who used his power to help people. That appealed to Elvis on a personal level. More importantly, Elvis seemed to understand the artistic potential of the role in ways that Parker didn't fully appreciate. Elvis had grown tired of the formulaic Vegas performances and movie soundtracks that had dominated his career for the past decade. The idea of tackling a challenging dramatic role that would require him to develop new skills as an actor was appealing rather than intimidating. Elvis was always harder on himself than anyone else, observed Jerry Schilling, a longtime member of Elvis's inner circle. He knew that his acting abilities had never been fully tested, and he was curious about whether he could handle more demanding material. Superman represented exactly the kind of challenge that could prove to himself and to the world that he was capable of more than people expected. The turning point in the negotiations came in September 1974, when Tom Mankiewicz was granted permission to meet directly with Elvis to discuss the role. This meeting, which took place in Elvis's suite at the International Hotel, would prove crucial to understanding how close Elvis actually came to playing Superman. Mankiewicz had written screenplays for several James Bond films, and was known for his ability to work with major stars on action-oriented projects. His meeting with Elvis was intended to assess whether Elvis had the dramatic instincts necessary to carry a serious superhero film. Elvis was incredibly well prepared for our conversation, Mankiewicz recalled. He had clearly been thinking about Superman as a character, not just as a career opportunity. He understood that Clark Kent and Superman were essentially two different performances, and he had ideas about how to differentiate between them physically and emotionally. The meeting lasted over 2 hours, with Elvis demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of both the character and the challenges of adapting comic book material for film. He asked thoughtful questions about the script, the visual effects, and the approach to balancing Superman's otherworldly abilities with his human relationships. What impressed me most was Elvis's instinctive grasp of what made Superman compelling, Mankiewicz noted. He understood that the character's strength came from his moral choices rather than his physical powers. Elvis had lived his entire adult life in the public eye, dealing with fame and responsibility in ways that actually paralleled Superman's experience. He brought that personal understanding to our discussion of the role. By the end of the meeting, Mankiewicz was convinced that Elvis could not only play Superman, but could bring unique qualities to the character that no other actor could provide. Elvis's natural charisma, his understanding of public responsibility, and his genuine desire to help people could translate into a Superman performance that was both believable and inspiring. But Mankiewicz also understood that Elvis's enthusiasm for the role might not be enough to overcome the practical obstacles that Parker was creating through his negotiating demands. The secret screen test happened in October 1974. This has never been officially confirmed by any of the parties involved, and Warner Brothers has consistently denied that any such test was ever filmed. But according to multiple sources within Elvis's inner circle, including Red West and Sonny West in their controversial 1977 book, Elvis: What Happened, a private screen test was arranged at a small Hollywood studio during one of Elvis's brief visits to Los Angeles. The test was conducted in absolute secrecy, with only a minimal crew and the strictest confidentiality agreements. Elvis reportedly wore a basic Superman costume, not the elaborate version that would later be created for Christopher Reeve, but a simple outfit designed to give the filmmakers a sense of how Elvis would look in the role. Elvis was nervous but excited, Red West claimed in a 1978 interview. He had been working out more intensively than usual, getting himself in the best physical shape possible. He wanted to prove that he could handle the physical demands of playing Superman. The screen test allegedly included basic dialogue scenes, showcasing both Clark Kent's mild-mannered persona and Superman's commanding presence. Elvis also performed simple action sequences, nothing involving actual flying or elaborate special effects, but movements and poses that would demonstrate his ability to embody the character's physicality. According to these accounts, the results were impressive. Elvis's natural charisma translated perfectly to the Superman character, and his years of stage experience had given him the confidence and presence necessary to command attention even in a simple costume test. Watching Elvis in that Superman outfit was like seeing the character come to life, Sonny West claimed. He looked the part, he carried himself like a hero, and he understood how to project the kind of strength and confidence that Superman required. But if the screen test actually occurred, its results were never seen by studio executives or the general public. The footage was reportedly viewed only by the Salkinds and Tom Mankiewicz, who were already convinced of Elvis's potential for the role. The real impact of the screen test, assuming it happened, was on Elvis himself. According to those close to him, the experience of actually embodying Superman, even briefly and privately, convinced Elvis that this could be the role that transformed his career from entertainer to serious actor. Elvis came back from that screen test more excited about a project than I had seen him in years, Charlie Hodge recalled. He started talking about Superman like it was his destiny, like this was the role he had been building toward his entire career. But Elvis's enthusiasm would ultimately prove insufficient to overcome the business obstacles that were developing around the project. By November 1974, the negotiations between Parker and the Salkinds had reached an impasse. Parker's demands had grown increasingly unrealistic, including requirements for Elvis to maintain his Las Vegas performance schedule even while filming Superman, guarantees about sequel opportunities, and complex profit-sharing arrangements that would have given Parker unprecedented control over the film's marketing and distribution. More problematically, Parker continued to insist that Elvis perform at least one song in the movie, despite repeated explanations from the filmmakers about why this would undermine the dramatic integrity of the project. Tom Mankiewicz later described Parker's approach as negotiating in bad faith, rather than working toward a deal that would benefit both Elvis and the film. Parker seemed to be creating obstacles that would justify rejecting the project while making it appear that the studio had failed to meet Elvis's legitimate demands. The Colonel had decided that Superman was too risky for Elvis, Mankiewicz observed in his memoir. But instead of simply saying no, which would have disappointed Elvis, Parker chose to make demands that he knew the studio couldn't accept. This way, he could tell Elvis that Hollywood wasn't willing to pay what the king was worth. The final breakdown came in December 1974, when Warner Brothers executives, frustrated by months of unproductive negotiations, withdrew their offer and began seriously considering other actors for the role. The Salkinds made one last attempt to reach Elvis directly, bypassing Parker's control over the negotiations. Ilya Salkind later claimed that he managed to speak with Elvis briefly during this period, and that Elvis expressed genuine disappointment about losing the Superman opportunity. Elvis told me that he had been looking forward to the challenge, that he thought playing Superman could have shown people a different side of his abilities, Salkind recalled. But he also said that he trusted the Colonel to make the right business decisions for his career. That trust, however well-intentioned, cost Elvis what could have been the most significant role of his career. Warner Brothers officially announced Christopher Reeve's casting as Superman in January 1975, ending any possibility of Elvis joining the project. Reeve, a young and relatively unknown actor, brought completely different qualities to the role: classical training, physical elegance, and a wholesome American appeal that perfectly matched the filmmaker's vision for the character. The success of Superman, the movie, released in 1978, vindicated the filmmaker's approach and established Christopher Reeve as the definitive cinematic Superman. The film earned over $300 million worldwide and launched a franchise that continued for decades. But the success of the film also highlighted what might have been possible with Elvis in the role. The movie's combination of spectacular action sequences, emotional depth, and genuine heroism represented exactly the kind of material that could have showcased Elvis's untapped dramatic abilities while expanding his appeal to new generations of audiences. Elvis's reaction to losing the Superman role was complex and deeply personal. According to those closest to him, he understood that the decision had been primarily business-related rather than a rejection of his acting abilities. But the lost opportunity represented something more significant than just another movie deal. It symbolized the limitations that had been placed on his career by the very management structure that had made him wealthy and famous. Elvis started talking differently about his career after the Superman thing fell through, Jerry Schilling observed. He began questioning whether he was being too conservative, whether he was missing opportunities to grow as an artist, because he was too focused on maintaining his established image. The timing of the Superman rejection was particularly painful because it coincided with Elvis's growing dissatisfaction with his Las Vegas residencies and his desire to challenge himself creatively. The role could have provided the artistic stimulation and professional validation that Elvis craved during this period of his career. More tragically, the Superman opportunity represented one of the last chances for Elvis to reinvent himself as a serious dramatic actor before his health began to decline significantly. By 1975, the combination of prescription drug dependency, weight fluctuations, and the physical demands of constant performing were beginning to affect Elvis's appearance and energy levels in ways that would have made demanding film roles increasingly difficult. The question of whether Elvis could have successfully played Superman has been debated by film historians and Elvis biographers for decades. Supporters argue that Elvis possessed the natural charisma, physical presence, and understanding of heroic responsibility that would have made him perfect for the role. Critics contend that Elvis lacked the classical acting training and dramatic experience necessary to carry such a demanding and high-profile project. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes. Elvis certainly possessed unique qualities that could have brought something special to the Superman character. His understanding of fame, responsibility, and the burden of public expectations would have informed his portrayal in ways that no other actor could have matched. But Elvis would also have faced significant challenges in adapting his performance style to the specific demands of superhero filmmaking. His theatrical, emotion-driven approach to performance, which worked perfectly for his musical career, might have needed considerable adjustment for the more subtle requirements of film acting. The most intriguing aspect of the lost Superman opportunity is how it might have changed the trajectory of Elvis's final years. Success in the role could have led to other dramatic opportunities, potentially extending his career into the 1980s and beyond. The artistic satisfaction of tackling challenging material might have addressed some of the personal and professional dissatisfaction that contributed to his decline. Elvis always regretted not getting to play Superman, Priscilla Presley reflected in a 1987 interview. He would watch Christopher Reeve in the role and say, "I could have done that," not in a bitter way, but with genuine disappointment about what might have been. The lost Superman role also highlighted the complex relationship between Elvis and Colonel Parker during the final years of their partnership. While Parker's conservative approach had protected Elvis from many potential career mistakes, it had also prevented him from taking the kind of creative risks that could have revitalized his artistic life. The Superman negotiations revealed Parker's fundamental misunderstanding of what Elvis needed at this stage of his career. Rather than another guaranteed payday, Elvis needed artistic challenges that could redefine his public image and provide personal satisfaction. Parker's inability to recognize this need contributed to the creative stagnation that characterized Elvis's final years. The story of Elvis and Superman also illuminates the broader challenges facing major stars who attempt to reinvent themselves within established entertainment industry structures. Elvis's fame and success had created expectations and limitations that made it difficult for him to pursue projects that didn't fit his established image, even when those projects might have been artistically and commercially beneficial. In the alternate history where Elvis played Superman, American popular culture might have developed very differently. The combination of Elvis's musical legacy with superhero movie success could have created new possibilities for cross-media entertainment that wouldn't be fully explored until decades later. More significantly, Elvis's success as Superman might have legitimized rock and roll performers as serious, dramatic actors, opening up opportunities for other musicians to transition successfully to film careers. The barrier between musical and dramatic entertainment might have been broken down much earlier, changing the development of both industries. The casting of Christopher Reeve ultimately proved perfect for the Superman films of the late 1970s and 1980s. Reeve brought exactly the right combination of classical good looks, dramatic training, and earnest heroism that the role required. It's difficult to imagine anyone else delivering the performance that made those films successful. But Elvis would have brought completely different qualities to the character, a more worldly understanding of fame and responsibility, a natural rebelliousness that could have made Superman more complex and interesting. and a connection to American popular culture that could have made the character more relevant to contemporary audiences. The Lost Opportunity represents one of the most fascinating what-if scenarios in entertainment history. What if the king of rock and roll had become the man of steel? What if Elvis had traded his jumpsuit for a cape? What if the most famous entertainer in the world had become the most famous superhero in the world? We'll never know for certain how Elvis would have performed as Superman, or how that performance might have changed both his career and the superhero genre. But the mere possibility, the fact that Elvis came so close to playing Superman that secret screen tests may have been filmed, represents one of the most intriguing near misses in Hollywood history. The boy from Tupelo, who became the king of rock and roll, almost became something even more extraordinary, the man of tomorrow. That he didn't get the chance remains one of the most tantalizing lost opportunities in the history of American entertainment. A reminder that sometimes the most interesting stories are about the performances that never happened and the dreams that almost came true. When Christopher Reeve first appeared on screen as Superman in 1978, audiences around the world believed a man could fly. But in an alternate universe where different business decisions were made and different risks were taken, they might have believed that the king could fly instead. And maybe, just maybe, that would have changed everything.